way that he presents it to patients is that, you have your recipe from Kentucky Fried Chicken on their fried chicken recipe, and then you have your recipe from Popeye's Fried Chicken. They're both fried chicken. They have subtle differences, but they're essentially pretty much the same.
So the provider just has to pick the treatment plan, and then our EMR automatically picks what is most cost effective for the patient and for the healthcare system. That was a huge win for us when we were able to utilize technology in order to help make these decisions.
Welcome to Medication Talk, an official podcast of TRC Healthcare, home of Pharmacist Letter, Prescriber Insights, and the most trusted clinical resources. Proud to be celebrating 40 years of unbiased evidence and recommendations. On this episode, listen in as our expert panel discusses considerations, challenges, and strategies related to the use and switching of biosimilars in clinical practice. You'll hear communication tips to address patient and prescriber concerns, as well as operational considerations for integrating biosimilars into practice. Our guests today are both clinical specialty pharmacists, Dr. Bhardwaja from Kaiser Permanente, Colorado, and Dr. Megan May from the Baptist Health Lexington Hamburg Cancer Care Center. You'll also hear practical advice from TRC's Editorial Advisory Board member, Dr. Craig Williams from the Oregon Health and Science University. This podcast is an excerpt from one of TRC's monthly Live CE webinars. Each month, experts and frontline providers discuss and debate challenges in practice, evidence-based practice recommendations, and other topics relevant to our subscribers.
And now, the CE information.
This podcast offers continuing education credit for pharmacists, pharmacy technicians, physicians, and nurses. Please log into your Pharmacist Letter, Pharmacy Technician's Letter, or Prescriber Insights account, and look for the title of this podcast in the list of available CE courses. For the purposes of disclosure, Dr. May reports a relevant financial relationship by serving on Speakers Bureau for lung cancer with Amgen, AstraZeneca, and Pharmacosmos. The other speakers you'll hear have nothing to disclose. All relevant financial relationships have been mitigated. Now, let's join TRC editors, Dr. Stephen Small and Sarah Clockers, and start our discussion.
So to start off with, Bharati, what factors should be considered before using or switching to a biosimilar?
Yeah, there are a lot of factors to consider. I think both from the perspective of the dispensing pharmacy, but also at an organizational level. But I think what's key to start is building trust, whether it's the prescriber, pharmacist, or at a patient level, really kind of communicating assurance that the biosimilar is safe and effective as the reference biologic. Some other considerations to factor in when switching to a biosimilar are, of course, the state laws around interchangeability of biosimilars, any institution policies on switching biosimilars, as well as payer coverage. And then I just wanted to bring up a quick comment that, even at the patient perspective level, there's still some hesitation around switching from a reference biologic to a biosimilar. And I think for patients, especially in the rheumatology patient population, there's a lot of this sense of emotional attachment, especially when the patient has been on a biologic for many years. And say, for example, the rheumatoid arthritis that's been in remission, free of flares and disease activity. And so providing assurance to the patient again that it's similar and efficacious, factoring in change management as well for providers so that they understand the reasons behind both clinically as well as from an affordable standpoint, that we do have good evidence supporting the switch and good evidence for biosimilars. So providing as much education and data up front, I think, is important for these similar switches.
One thing I was going to say that's a little different in our oncology population, for the most part, we don't typically switch from the reference product to a biosimilar. For our patients, they're usually started on one or the other. And so I haven't had the same experience because I haven't started a patient on the reference product and then had to switch. And that's because most of our patients, unfortunately, are not on the same product for long term, like what we see in rheumatology. So, for my patients, I agree. Patient education is extremely important. And I usually get really good buy in from our patients because we're not making a change in the middle of that treatment algorithm.
Yeah, I just reiterate to what Bharti says, Steve, that remembering where the patient's at and certain their attachment to that medication. If you had horrible psoriatic arthritis and this drug has kept you in remission, this is the time. I think using the term generic does not necessarily help in explaining what a biosimilar is and what that data is for that biosimilar. Because yeah, in those chronic conditions, I mean, the switch, as we discussed, can sometimes be very helpful to the patient's pocketbook as well as the systems. Having a discussion of what the drug really is, and I do not really use the term generic in that setting, just because it's you do have to be empathetic to the patient who's associating this drug with perhaps a very good disease response, and then they get understandably very nervous about a switch to something we're calling a generic, especially if the switch is going on at the pharmacy outside the prescriber's office.
We're actually getting a question right now from the audience. Which patients should avoid using a biosimilar based on what we've said so far? Are there any thoughts to add to that?
Really, most patients can get a biosimilar. Things that come to mind if a patient has a hypersensitivity reaction, for example, to the reference product, and it has the same active and inactive ingredients as the biosimilar, that might not be a good option just to switch to the biosimilar. The other thing to remember if a patient does not have an efficacious response to either the reference product or the biosimilar, you don't really switch to the other in order to see if you get a better response. So it's just important to remember, like we said, they're highly similar in safety, purity, and potency, but we don't want to switch between one and the other just to try to get better efficacy. That's not how we use biosimilars.
I think who should avoid a biosimilar if it's an initial therapy. I think as you're hearing, no one biosimilar is certainly fair to start. That's not something to switch to if you think it's going to be safer or more effective. Yeah, no one comes to mind as someone who shouldn't start on a given biosimilar for a given biologic.
Yeah, excellent points about efficacy here and keeping that in mind. On the flip side of that, we have an audience member asking, can you use a biosimilar if a patient had a bad reaction to the reference product? Is that any different?
I can give you the FDA's answer to that because we had to look at this for the Board of Pharmacy review, and you should expect the same adverse effects as well as expect the same efficacy. So never say never in terms of maybe something being different, but the FDA did a pretty deep dive in available literature for this, and yeah, they cannot find differences. So whether it's an infusion reaction or an immune response to the biologic product itself, you should generally expect the same adverse reaction. So if you're trying this, certainly do so very carefully with monitoring.
Great, excellent thoughts there. When should a patient switch to another biosimilar of the same med versus just simply switching to a different med? Can we give a patient example of maybe something you've seen in practice, perhaps a medication that might be common where this takes place?
Yeah, I think, again, it boils down to efficacy and safety. If patients had developed any kind of a hypersensitivity and or allergic reaction, then yes, we would avoid that class of medications in terms of their mechanism of action, whether it's a reference biologic or a biosimilar, and just consider something that is a different mechanism of action. For example, like Amgevita. The patient was switched from the reference biologic to the biosimilar, and we're seeing more flares, worsening disease activity, longer time of stiffness when they wake up in the morning. Then, yeah, I would probably considering switching them to a different biologic out of maybe the TNF inhibitor class to see if we can get a better handle on their disease activity.
So I say we sometimes remind prescribers this is not if you have a bad reaction to pravastatin, trisimvastatin. These are not drugs in the same class but different compound. These are the same compound, practically speaking, from an interchangeable standpoint. So if you're not responding to the drug, certainly potentially think about a different biologic altogether. But yeah, otherwise expect the same efficacy and the same adverse effects from a biosimilar to the parent drug.
Yep, I like that contrast to traditional drugs there.
Steve, one example I had at my institution, we were giving a biosimilar for bevacizumab, and there was actually a back order of the medication. And so we did have to switch our patients back to the reference product. Again, that was just because of not being able to access the biosimilar at that time. That's really been the main time we've had to make a switch in the middle of treatment.
Yeah, that's a great point to the earlier point of what the benefits are. I think people often think the benefits are to the health system of saving costs. Having a second plant manufacturing these products somewhere else, as we all just fully recover from our IV fluid shortage that caused so much trouble a couple of years ago. It's just nice to have someone else making the same product in case of some sort of a loss or factory taken offline or just manufacturing shortage.
And I'm sure there is some hesitation we may encounter from patients when it comes to using or switching to biosimilars. How do you address those concerns?
I found a communication tactic that I've kind of shamelessly stole for one of my really good rheumatologists that I work with. And the way that he presents it to patients is that, you have your recipe from Kentucky Fried Chicken on their fried chicken recipe, and then you have your recipe from Popeye's fried chicken. They're both fried chicken. They have subtle differences, but they're essentially pretty much the same. So I've used that analogy with patients as well, and it makes it a little bit easier and it's a little more subtle to kinda give them an idea of what this change means.
Some other changes we've made once biosimilars came to the market was in the cancer center, the pharmacists actually do the patient education in my institution, and we have personalized calendars that we make for everyone. Now we have the templates saved, so you don't have to start from scratch every time, but one thing we learned, we included all the different brand names for the biosimilar and biosimilar options and the reference product on the calendars, and then we just highlighted the one that the patient is getting. We learned that that just saved us time from having to completely rewrite it on the calendar every time with using a biosimilar versus the reference product. The other thing we made a change to was we obtain consent from patients before we give them any treatment for their cancer diagnosis. And at first, our consent had you list out the specific agent that the patient was getting. And so we were being very specific, including using the generic name and then those four letters that come after with our biosimilars. And we updated our consent across our healthcare system so we wouldn't have to keep reconsenting, because if we did make a change for whatever reason, we were getting another consent. So we actually updated our verbiage and we changed it to whomever she or he may designate to administer the following chemotherapy and or immunotherapy, in parentheses, may include an FDA approved biosimilar or generic product, close parentheses. So that saved us time, the pharmacists and the providers, from having to reconsent these patients. And then the last thing I really make sure I point out to patients when talking about biosimilars is sometimes I think if we say it's a lower cost, they might think, oh, it's not as good as the reference product. So just reassuring patients that, you get a lower cost because they also get to go through that abbreviated pathway in order to get approval. So it's not costing the manufacturer as much. So they're able to pass down that lower cost to patients in the healthcare system. So again, just making sure we explain very clearly to patients what they are getting and using our words carefully. Like we said, I don't use the word generic when discussing this with patients. I make sure I use the word biosimilar and explain what that is. If you're interested, the FDA actually has a really nice sheet that you can give to patients. It's called What Patients Need to Know. And it is 3 pages that explains what a biosimilar is in patient-friendly terms. And I hand that out to all my patients. I think it's a great reference to have.
I agree with all that, and I think to add to what you just shared, Megan, is also including all the providers that are part of the larger healthcare team that touches the patient. And so whether it's the infusion nurses, the frontline nurses that might be following up with patients on lab results, the physicians, the outpatient pharmacists, and providing them with communication tools. And like you said, maybe it's an FAQ or even coming up with scripting on how to communicate to the patient so that the patient is hearing the same messaging from every clinician touch point. Another thing that we found that was a great learning is yes, we inform patients of, for example, a formulary change and that they'll be switched from their reference biologic to a biosimilar, whether it's in a letter form. But we include verbiage in there that they can always schedule an office visit or a phone visit with their rheumatologist. And hearing it from the rheumatologist first really kind of sets that switch to move in a successful way so that other, healthcare providers that interact with the patient know that they've had that conversation with the rheumatologist and hopefully they've kind of helped provide some confidence in that switch.
I'll add to see those are great comments. While we've been very careful to distinguish generic from biosimilar, when you're describing it to a patient, I think a lot of patients are on a lot of generics for other medications. Rarely is this the only medication patients are on. And I think people have become fairly accepting of generics for many other medications. So if a patient says, "Oh, I mean, like a generic," to your earlier question, there I often say, yes, it is similar to a generic in concept. And many patients then actually accept that. So I agree with not using the term generic up front, but as you're explaining this, it can kind of sound like generic. And if the patient seems very comfortable with that, then I'm happy to say, yes, it is similar in concept to a generic, although it is a biosimilar. Sometimes you can leverage that term a bit if that's something that the patient is actually comfortable with.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know we had the fried chicken recipe, but it's a different concept for patients to kind of understand when up until now, there's been a lot of brand to generic conversions. Like, okay, I get it. It's a generic. And so, yes, I've kind of used the term of like pseudo generic when I'm talking to patients about switches.
Yeah, if we could see they're on, 2 blood pressure medications and 2 inhalers, and they're all generics for brandeds, and, I mean, again, many patients have become, I think, pretty accepting as we've had very good experiences with generics over the past couple decades.
I really like that term pseudo generic. I hadn't heard it used before, but I might be stealing that for my educations in the future. That's a good term to use there.
We have a similar audience question now asking how you approach concerns from providers. Any success stories on guiding hesitant prescribers to using biosimilars?
At first, when biosimilars came in the oncology world, I did have some providers that were very hesitant to adopt them into our healthcare system. It actually took us about a year for all of our providers to feel really comfortable. I like to say I went on a biosimilar tour when we first started to want to use them. So we have 9 hospitals across the state. So me and another pharmacist, we literally were going office to office talking to our oncologist about biosimilars and really explaining what it was. Because for us, that was a new concept. And one thing I pointed out to my providers is even when you have different lots of the reference product, you can't exactly replicate that living organism within these biologics. And so, yes, they're not biosimilars, but they're also not exactly identical. Just like what we said with the chicken example for patients, that's what I like to remind my providers. So even lot to lot, there could be differences for the reference product. So just think of it like that. This is something we needed to do to be able to provide more access to patients and be able to be financially cautious and conserving for our healthcare system. And so eventually all the providers came on board. And honestly, now in 2025, it's not a problem. My providers don't think twice about it now, but it was a barrier we had to overcome in the very beginning.
Yeah, Megan, we had the same experience the first time we went through a switch. There was a lot of hesitation, and we just had, studies from Europe on their experience with switching from a reference product to a biosimilar. But after we kind of got through some of those growing pains, there's a lot of change management. Our second and all the follow-up switches that we had were pretty seamless. And I think it's really important, depending on the institution that you're at, is having an operational strategic plan that kind of outlines how the switch is going to be deployed so that the institution includes some of the factors that we discussed around communication, education, but also what it means to the patient when you're kind of comparing, well, here's your copay when you're on a reference biologic, but here's what your copay could be on a biosimilar, which is pretty huge. And to a prescriber, being able to continue a high cost biologic in an affordable way, it's huge.
Yeah, Australia, the providers will be very open to the potential for the benefit to the patient of the cost savings. So if they are having to burden a fair amount of the increased tier price or depending where they're at in their kind of insurance plan for the year. So yeah, being able to stay on the product certainly supersedes even any prescriber's concern about the biosimilar versus a branded the reference product. So, and I'd come back to Megan's point too that I remember walking into a room of angry neurologists about 20 years ago, and our institution switched to generic phenytoin from branded Dilantin, and everyone was convinced that patients were having seizures and complications from the generic. But when we kind of explain what an AB rated generic is and the fact that, like Megan said, the branded product here is not the same thing batch to batch. So not every Humira injection you give is exactly the same, even if you're using the reference product. And that concept did help a lot. That's I think there's a misperception that it's the exact same thing every time with the reference product, and that is not the case. So there's variance with the biosimilar and variance with the branded product, and that helped a lot with generics 20 years ago, and that does help a lot with biosimilars now.
Great ideas for getting patients and providers on board with biosimilars. And now that leads to questions about how we can streamline biosimilar use. Bharti, how should prescribers write prescriptions for biologics or biosimilars? Are there certain techniques we should be advising to make sure the prescribing process is as seamless as possible?
Yeah, I think it's, one thing it's kind of confusing with the way that biosimilars and their names are presented with their core name and a suffix. And since there's so many biosimilars now, I think over like 70 have been approved, it can get a little confusing. And so I think for the most part, most prescribers will write the prescription using the proprietary name of the biosimilar. So similar is what is done with a biologic reference product. So I think that is, I would say, would maintain some of the safety parameters and not confusing what's prescribed.
Great. And Megan, are there any technology changes we can use to streamline biosimilar use to guide prescribing almost?
At my institution, we rely heavily on our electronic medical record now. So within our EMR, it is smart enough to look and evaluate the patient's insurance, and then it automatically defaults the preferred biosimilar or reference product into our treatment plans. So the provider just has to pick the treatment plan, and then our EMR automatically picks what is most cost effective for the patient and for the healthcare system. That was a huge win for us when we were able to utilize technology in order to help make these decisions. One downside about that is we do have all the biosimilars listed. So as we know, with one reference product, you can have several biosimilars. And so for the pharmacy and the infusion center, they keep all of those medications on the shelf as well. So we did have to think about storage when we made this update to our EMR, that we were going to offer all of these options to our patients in order to provide the best option for them. And we actually update this list quarterly. So we reevaluate their insurance and our contracted costs with the manufacturer for what we pay for the drug as well, in order to select what we consider the preferred product for each patient individually.
That's a really handy tool there. And then does that ever back you into a corner though if there are, say, supply issues with a certain biosimilar that the EHR picks? Is it easy to switch off of that if that occurs?
In Kentucky, we still would contact the provider to tell them we need to make a change for a different biosimilar if we did have an issue with like back order, for example. And then the provider actually would rewrite that prescription and sign it. So it can cause an extra step in the end from pharmacy if there is an issue like that.
And Megan, you bring up a good point here about insurance coverage. So I want to highlight that technology can also help identify when payer coverage may require product switches, including, of course, in the community pharmacy setting. Look for prior auths or other electronic messaging that may guide which biosimilars are preferred. We know that these products can cost less, but payers may still vary in terms of which one they'll cover, especially when there are many biosimilars for the same reference product out there.
Yeah, and different assistance programs might cover different things as well. It's tricky. Which brings us to we have all alluded to how many biosimilars there are now. And just we have all these different products, especially in your organization, Megan, where you carry all of them. So, what are some tips for pharmacy teams to ensure proper storage, preparation, dispensing the right product when you have so many on the shelf?
That was a concern that I had in the beginning is what if we dispense the wrong one, right? Fortunately, we know it's highly similar, and so I don't think it would have necessarily caused patient harm at all because efficacy is similar between them. But what I was concerned about in the infusion center, we don't have that point of sale like you do at a retail pharmacy or if you're using a specialty pharmacy. So for ours, our patients are billed on the back end. And if you dispense the wrong preferred product that we got prior auth for before, you might not have your insurance pay for it, right? They might reject that in the end. And then that's going to be a problem for the patient as well with cost. So we've done a nice job with our prior auth team. We worked with them to make sure they're very specific in a specific note area in our EMR. So our pharmacy and pharmacy technicians knew where to look to know what was authorized by the insurance to make sure they are mixing the appropriate reference product or biosimilar product. As far as I know, we haven't had any issues with this, but in the beginning, that was a main concern. Another thing that's helped is, again, using technology. So we do have a scanning system. So our pharmacy technicians, they scan the order, the label that the pharmacist had printed, and then scan the vial before they do any admixtures. We also have our pharmacists actually lay their eyes on the vial and compare it to the label before we actually do admixture as well. Other things pharmacists and pharmacy technicians really need to be aware of with these biosimilars, they could have differences in infusion rates. So we had to work with our pumps that we use in the infusion center to make sure it was specific with each of the reference or biosimilar products. It could also have what you mix it in different. So fluid differences in the admixture part too. So just making sure everything is labeled very clearly on that label that we put on the bag for our patients. So nursing, pharmacy are all aware of which product they're using and all the precautions that come with it. Also being really careful on your shelf about labeling which like the reference product and then each of the biosimilars. Like for example, we have ours in bins and we would never put a reference product and a biosimilar in the same bin. We make sure it's separated so you don't accidentally grab the wrong vial before mixing.
Logistics, it does become big, and I would reference that last point, don't put the biosimilar in the same area. So we're all familiar with stocking pharmacy shelves and the generic being next to the branded, but not necessarily a good idea here because a mistake can be extremely expensive. So make sure someone purposely has to go somewhere in particular to get the biosimilar versus the reference product.
Great points. Thank you. And there are others we can point out. To emphasize again, stay current on your knowledge of state laws regarding interchanging biosimilars, and then ensure patients are counseled by a pharmacist when they are switching to a biosimilar or picking up a different product than previously. They can point out differences the patient needs to know, such as storage requirements, or different injection devices, or different administration techniques from the prior product.
We hope you enjoyed and gained practical insights from listening to this discussion. Now that you've listened, pharmacists, pharmacy technicians, physicians, and nurses can receive CE credit. Just log into your pharmacist letter, pharmacy technician's letter, or Prescriber Insights account and look for the title of this podcast in the list of available CE courses. On those websites, you'll also be able to access and print out additional materials on this topic, like charts and other quick reference tools. If you're not yet a pharmacist letter, pharmacy technician's letter, or Prescriber Insights subscriber, now's the time. Sign up today to stay ahead with trusted, unbiased insights and continuing education. And as a listener, you can save 10% on a new subscription with code MT1025 at checkout. Be sure to follow or subscribe, rate, and review this show in your favorite podcast app, or find the show on YouTube by searching for TRC Healthcare or clicking the link in the show notes. You can also reach out to provide feedback or make suggestions by emailing us at contactus@trchealthcare.com. Thanks for listening to Medication Talk.